Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we get started?
All right. Hello, all. Good afternoon. Welcome to Parenting Athletes, Fostering Athlete Mental Health and Coping. My name is Jessica Nagel. I will be the moderator today. And I am really honored to introduce my colleagues and friends, Dr. Kristene Hossepian and Dr. Victoria Cosgrove. Dr. Hossepian is a licensed clinical psychologist and clinical assistant professor in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Stanford University. Dr. Hossepian has been a competitive athlete at the high school and collegiate levels with 2 Olympic runs for both handball and basketball. She has a history of coaching youth between the ages of 6 and 18 and continues to play basketball to this day. Currently, Dr. Hossepian is an attending psychologist at the Comprehensive Care Program, serving children and adolescents who are medically compromised due to complications with their eating disorders. Additionally, Dr. Hossepian works within Dr. Victoria Cosgrove's Stress, Resilience, Emotion, and Mood, the STREAM Lab, to identify the ways that psychobiological stress responsivity is implicated in the emergence and propagation of affective symptomatology. She and Dr. Cosgrove have worked together for almost 10 years on studies that promote prevention and intervention of mood symptomatology in at-risk youth. Dr. Cosgrove is a licensed clinical child and family psychologist and assistant professor in the Division of Child and Psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Dr. Cosgrove's work advances clinical medicine by concentrating on ways that individual biological and psychological responses to social stress impact health and well-being. She is a co-director of the Pediatric Mood Disorders Clinic and the director of the Stress, Resilience, Emotion, and Mood Lab, which studies how the ways that kids and families respond to social stressors in their day-to-day lives may lead to problems with mental health. She's had the privilege of working alongside her co-presenter, Dr. Hossepian, for nearly a decade in the STREAM Lab. Notably, Dr. Cosgrove has been an age group competitive endurance athlete since her 20s. To date, she has completed over 25 marathons, 2 Ironman triathlons, multiple 50K and 24-hour trail races, and countless other triathlons and running races on the road and the trails. She is also the proud mother to 4 young athletes, 3 soccer players, and 1 basketball star who compete at various levels with clubs and teams in the Bay Area. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you. All right, so just to orient everyone before we jump in, so these are sort of the broad domains that we're going to be talking about today. So we'll start off with trying to understand a little bit about why athlete mental health and coping is important, give you a little bit of background on coping, parent communication, things of that nature, and then we will transition into some really practical strategies and skills for parents to foster that athlete mental health and coping. And specifically, we'll talk about things like the car ride home, feedback, in addition to just interactions that parents might have with other parents, kids, and coaches. Okay.
All right.
Pass this
And
along.
Jess, you have clicking access?
I do have clicking access. Here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I'm going to start us off. And we wanted to start with a statement from the International Olympic Committee to really illustrate just how important athlete mental health is. So the IOC released a position statement on youth athlete development that talks about the importance of the psychological development of resilient and adaptive athletes. In case you're interested, it's published. Bergeron is the first author in 2015. So more specifically, the statement illustrates really the following multifaceted goal for sport, which is developing healthy, capable, and resilient young athletes while attaining widespread, inclusive, sustainable, and enjoyable participation and success for all levels of individual athletic achievement. So what does this mean? Well, the IOC is essentially advocating for sport experiences to equip young people with appropriate coping skills and psychosocial qualities, regardless of sporting level or attainments. Now, that's not an easy task for anyone involved in a budding athlete's life. And I speak from experience on this with my little people, especially parents. let's face it, what parents are tasked with doing within the sporting context is supporting their child, managing themselves and their own well-being, and also managing their interactions with others in the youth sport arena, right? Coaches, directors, referees, everyone under the sun. We're going to talk about that. So what we're going to be talking about today is how parents can navigate all of these responsibilities and foster athlete mental health and well-being. Go ahead, Jess. Okay. So first, a little background on parent-child communication patterns. And my guess is that most of you who are here are parents and probably parents of athletes. So, and your parents who regularly communicate with your kids, and you're concerned about that, which is why you're here. So what we know as psychologists is that communication patterns that are generally positive and which reflect warmth, consistent discipline, and agreement on solutions to problems are associated with positive child outcomes, including, go for it, Jess. So decreased conflict behaviors, improved mental and physical health, and resiliency. So more specifically in sport, behaviors that reflect warmth, positive affect, and mastery climates are positively associated with perceptions of parental support, which is really important. And this means that understanding the dynamics of communication between parents and athletes is really, really important for promoting positive psychosocial outcomes among youth athletes. So a little background on coping. So what exactly is coping? We use this term broadly in our lay lives or day to day. But how do you really define something like coping? So in our psychological space, the way we think about it is that coping is a process of conscious efforts to manage demands that are appraised as taxing or exceeding an individual's resources. So if you think about young athletes, what are these demands? What do they look like? So they can include a multitude of different things, but some of the stressors can be pressure to perform. It's a huge one, conflicts with coaches or opponents or teammates for that matter. Fears of injury, right? I mean, we all hear in popular press day to day narratives from successful athletes who have long histories of relationships with injuries over time, right? That have helped them both grow, but also have led to a great deal of struggle that's happened over the course of their performing lives. So making game errors, this goes back to this fear of pressure to perform, right? You make an error, the coach takes you out, life is over, is a common kind of cognitive narrative that goes on across many age ranges. And it's sometimes an accurate one, depending on the coach, right? Sometimes kids are not allowed to try and fail and try again. And we know as psychologists that that can be very damaging, right? If the message is that don't try, don't try because if you fail, that's the end. Poor coach-athlete relationships. That's a sort of a euphemistic term for many, many different flavors of what can occur. We'll discuss more of that, and I'm sure there'll be questions in that arena how to handle that when the power differential is very often perceived to be one-sided in various environments. And if folks are interested in actually like references in the academic space, we have lots of readings. People research this stuff. They really care about it. It's important. Okay. So just some quick background on coping. So If athletes face all of these different types of stressors that I just enumerated, how exactly do they manage these stressors? So the good news is that adolescent young athletes do use a variety of coping strategies to deal with these stressors. And if you're a parent, you've seen your child in all likelihood work their way through trying many hats on as far as how to navigate this world. So some of them include seeking social support. So that can be parents, it can be siblings, it can be just hanging out, doing nothing with friends. It can also include focusing on technical points and increasing effort. So otherwise known as just sheer hard work, right? And I know in our family, we try to go back to that as something that no one can ever take away from you in all domains, right? So something that leads to a feeling of internal pride and something that doesn't belong to anyone else. Sometimes some wishful thinking about what's going to happen in spite of what the reality is in front of you. So not certain whether you're going to be rostered for a game or whether you're going to get playing time, but sort of having a narrative that, well, maybe this will happen. And as a parent, again, you see children sort of navigate that both on the front end and the back end when the reality sort of may set in, depending on the competitive level. Ignoring. So this is, I mean, again, these are things we all do in our lives, right? If I don't want to really deal with something, what's a fantastic way to deal with it or not deal with it? It just ignore it. If I just pretend it's not there, it's not there for a while. So create some distance between it. And sometimes it can be really adaptive, right? So messing with your younger sister's dolls instead of navigating the actual stressful reality of a challenging relationship with a variety of teammates can, be pretty, and maybe not adaptive, right? Pretty strong coping skill. So these are just a few. And if we open this up to folks putting in the chat, I'm sure all your kids have lots of different strategies for coping with both the positives and negatives of sport arenas, environments. So interestingly, and somewhat unsurprisingly, evidence pretty much shows that athletes' coping strategies fluctuate over the course even of a single competition, right? So take a 40-minute kids basketball game, their brains are going to do lots of different things to cope with what information is coming in at various given times, whether their teammates passing to them, whether their coach is giving them positive praise, whether their coach is giving them negative praise, whether they've tripped, whether their shoes untied. All these things are giving them internal cues about how to navigate, and they're responding with creative coping strategies. So, for example, athletes use coping strategies. This also happens over longer periods of time, I should say, too, not just during single competition. The single competition piece is kind of interesting, though. So athletes use coping strategies more frequently during their most important competitions. Makes sense. And really what this means is that young athletes try to cope more when they face more stressors. Okay. So similarly, adolescent athletes have an increased repertoire of coping strategies compared to that of younger athletes. And athletes appear to cope more effectively with stressors as they age, which makes sense. And it is a good thing, right? Developmentally, they're filling their toolbox with different ways to perceive the information that's coming in at high power speeds from outside. So there's many studies, Compass et al., Holt et al., from the last couple of decades, and they suggest that adolescent athletes learn more about how to cope with stress as they gain more experience. So when it comes to parental involvement, research has shown that positive parental influence. So any number of studies, Hauser et al. So positive parental influence and parental support, all related to adolescents' use of adaptive coping strategies. So what does that mean? Athletes who perceived moderate and high levels of parental support report using active coping and increased training. There we go with that hard work aspect to deal with stressors, something that no one can take away from you. Conversely, young athletes who perceived low parental support, parents not believing in them, or delivering messages that are not positive, report higher use of self-blame and venting of emotions, less acceptance of what's going on, positive reinterpretation, or significantly less positive reinterpretation, and less social support. So things that aren't associated with positive coping. Athletes who report low perceptions of parental support also used fewer coping strategies overall and may have been at risk of developing maladaptive patterns of coping. And of course, we're talking about young people, and as child psychologists, what we're thinking about is patterns that develop young, we all know can stick around. It's harder to change patterns that are already in place than it is to start developing patterns that are going to adequately help you cope with stressors throughout your life. So how exactly do athletes learn about coping in the sport context? Athletes, parents, and coaches report that exposure to multiple stressful experiences contributes to learning about coping. So, okay, it's okay if things are stressful. They also report that they learned about coping with stressors such as poor performance, tryouts, pressure to perform, slumps in performance. So it's not a one-way street if you just work hard in anything, sports or otherwise, right? We don't all just keep going up indefinitely. There's always a roller coaster. Time management, balancing sport with school. That's a big one that comes up, especially in our community, where academics is highly emphasized. Excuse me. Conflicts, right? Conflicts with teammates and coach criticism, parental criticism, all sorts of criticism coming from the other side. That can be a really big one that comes up. And then, of course, finally, this injury piece of things that is often unpreventable, right? If you go through a lifelong relationship with a sport, you will be injured at some point. It will occur through a variety, and all of us use positive strategies to try to avoid that, and those work until they don't. And because we all age and we all go through unpredictable stressors in life, and kids included, right? That put them at higher risk for developing injuries. And we're not going to talk about this at length, but with kids, especially child athletes, lack of sleep can be a huge one, right? That puts kids at greater risk for developing injuries. So adolescent athletes who are exposed to stressful experiences in sports, they do have opportunities to learn coping strategies via these that then they can use to cope with stressors in the future. And that's the optimized model that we hope for. And essentially, athletes develop coping strategies through direct experiences facing multiple stressful situations. So essentially all these things kind of have to happen. And that doesn't mean they aren't going to be painful. And especially as parents, helping your child navigate through them, it's poignantly painful to help navigate and also know when and when not to rescue your child from a negative, coaching or sporting relationship. Okay, so why is coping important? Before we get into more of a context for coping, we first have to understand why. Why do we care? So it seems self-explanatory, but to be more specific, consistent coping leads to consistent sport performance. So that seems obvious, but it's not always what plays out, and it takes a lot of effort and work on the part of the athlete, and then in the case of families, the part of the family system as well. So an athlete who hasn't learned how to cope, or a family system that hasn't learned how to cope with their athlete stressors, you can see children and adolescents show their frustrations and show that it's actually really getting to them, and that's going to in turn affect their performance, right? Which is this negative feedback loop that, unless caught, can be really toxic, for lack of a better way to describe it. So secondarily, learning about coping often leads to persistence in dealing with stressors, that is sustained effort in dealing with stressors. So resilience, if you will. For example, let's talk about slumps in performance. So if you haven't scored a goal for many games in a row, or you've hit a shooting slump, you just have to keep going and come up with the best situation possible in front of you. And a final outcome of coping reported by parents, but not the athletes, is the ability to employ coping strategies independently, right? I mean, that's kind of our goal as parents always, regardless of whether we're talking about sports or other things, is that we're kind of hoping to get our kids in a spot where one day they can do this on their own, right? And it's probably sooner rather than later is going to lead to the best outcome. A final outcome of coping reported by parents is coping independently, but without prompting or initiation by the parents, right? So parents feel they had a role to play in helping athletes achieve independence and coping, and sometimes having parents intervene prematurely on behalf of an athlete attempting to cope with stressors is actually really detrimental to developing independence in coping. And this can be really a tricky one for parents in particular, and also across developmental ages. So I have 4 kids, and they range in age from 6 to 12 and a half, right? It's easy with the 6-year-old, right? If it's a negative environment, I swoop in and take her right out. And she just says, okay, can we go get ice cream? And I say, sure, it's fine. With the 12 and a half-year-old who works 15 plus hours a week on his sport of trade, who has developed a real independence and works very hard, the line is blurred. It's not so clear when I jump in and when I don't jump in, and that's a true struggle as a parent that I deeply empathize with, and I encourage parents to think about, and we'll talk about this within a developmental context, right? And that's hard, because if you have kids, or if you don't, as soon as you get used to something with a child, it changes, right? I mean, it's from day one of a baby, right? They're able to sleep, and 2 minutes later they're not, and you think, wait, what did I do? I didn't do anything wrong. So anyway, I am going to turn it over to Kristene now, and she's going to talk about context for learning.
Great. Thank you, Victoria.
Sure.
Okay. So now that we understand how athletes cope and why it is so important, we have to talk about the best context by which athletes learn about coping. So, really what you'll hear me say over and over again in the latter half of this presentation is talking about creating what's deemed a psychologically safe environment, right? So what that means is creating an environment where athletes feel comfortable and confident to talk about the stressors and talk about the way in which they're coping. So it seems kind of self-explanatory, right? Psychologically safe. It's very actually complex to understand what exactly a psychologically safe environment looks like practically, right? So how can you create that supportive environment as a parent? Well, so for starters, really it's listening and monitoring your own reactions around discussions with your children, right? So, for instance, what we hear a lot of parents say is that the quieter that they become, the more they end up getting to hear and the more they end up getting to listen to what's actually going on in their child's life. So as soon as parents start saying, well, you should have done this or you should have done more of that, it's possible that what happens is athletes just shut down, just like any other human being, right? And you don't get those gems of how it is that they're struggling and how it is that they're coping, right? The other thing, again, seems relatively self-explanatory, but is more subtle. Reading athletes' body language, right? And their responsiveness when you are talking about coping. So take an interest in what's going on in their lives outside of the sporting context, right? So are they stressed out with school? Are they stressed out with their friends? Pay attention to their body language. If they end up becoming more closed off when they're talking to you, shift something. Pay attention to their facial expressions. If it looks like their affect has changed, again, that could be a really good indication to shift something in the way that you're talking to them. So really, another piece is just reading their mood and trying to understand the broader context of their life, right? And lastly, the thing to keep in mind is fostering independence, which is a balance, right, between supporting athletes in becoming independent in coping while also protecting them. So Victoria mentioned this a little bit earlier, right? You have to tailor to what is going on in that child's life along with their developmental stage. So as parents, you typically have an instinct to protect, make everything better, right? Because it's hard to see your child in some sort of distress. The unfortunate piece about that is that you inadvertently might actually illustrate that kiddos aren't equipped to deal with whatever stressor it is that's in front of them. So it's a really subtle balance between protecting them and wanting them to be independent. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I like to call this kind of a gentle firmness and a gentle challenge so that they're not overwhelmed by stress and they feel like they can come back to you as sort of this secure base, but you're also not running in and fixing everything for them. Okay. So now, what exactly are some of those strategies that the parents can use to sort of facilitate this athlete mental health and coping? We've talked in abundance around athlete mental health and coping, but practically, we're in it for what exactly can we do? So again, for starters, one is just questioning and reminding, right? So questioning is really helping athletes talk about how it is that they're coping with stressors, right? And reminders are really helping them recall what stressors are available to them that maybe they've used in the past in specific situations. So for example, what you might ask is, okay, well, what do you think you could have done differently to make whatever it was that you were trying to make work for you and for your team, right? And then the reminding piece comes in repetitively. And what I mean by repetitively, I mean every practice, every game, every competition. It's a constant process. So that could look something like, okay, let's talk about the choices that you made in this particular scenario, right? And what were the consequences of those choices? Again, you're not approaching it with judgment. You're just being really curious about helping them analyze the situation and sort of deduce, okay, what worked, what didn't work, right? And then sort of asking again, so if you were to go forward in a similar situation, would you have made a different choice? What would that look like? And you can always bring in how you can support the athlete in this context, right? So the next question, the next step you can take is something like, okay, well, if you were to choose to make a different decision in the future, then how as a parent can I help remind you to do those things, right? So lots of questioning, lots of reminding. Secondarily, parents can help athletes learn about coping by just actually providing perspective to help them see stressors in context. So the best example I have of this is actually the injury context. So especially for kiddos who are struggling with a slump in performance or maybe really frustrated with being on the bench after having some really good games, or they're coming off the bench when they feel like they should be a starter. Let's take injuries, for example, right? When you're injured, you're on the bench all of the time. That means, missing the big games, missing the big practices. So what's the positive side of that piece? Well, it gives you a lot of really good perspective for people who are on the bench consistently and who are dealing with stressors consistently, right? So it allows athletes to sort of take that perspective of maybe some of their peers and some of their teammates and think through, well, how did they work through this stressor? How did they work through this context, right? And are there some strategies that I can employ there for myself in coping with maybe the shooting slump that I'm in, right? Another way to sort of facilitate this athlete mental health and coping is just sharing experiences, right? So sharing experiences in terms of the way that you as a parent learn about coping, right? And I want to make this very clear, even if you're a parent that really doesn't understand the sporting context, doesn't have any sort of sport experience, that's okay, because what you're fundamentally talking about is not the sport, but coping and how you've dealt with adversity in the past, right? So you can always make the caveat of, yes, I understand that I don't understand the sport context. And in the past, these are some of the things that have worked for me. I'm not sure if this will work for you, but just in case you're interested, I can talk you through what works for me, right? So again, approaching it non-judgmentally and giving them options in terms of whether or not they want to use those strategies. Another important point that, again, we'll talk about a little bit more is limiting stressful experiences. We've talked about this briefly, but the term I really like to use here is dosing. So dosing stressful experiences. So again, this is basically limiting the extent to which athletes are exposed to stressors that are just unreasonably overwhelming to them. So this, you do have a little bit of parent judgment here, right? You're making a little bit of a judgment call here as a parent to understand what is too much for them and what's just the right amount of stress for them. So again, we don't want to inadvertently shelter athletes from any sort of stressors and give them the idea that they can't deal with stressors. And at the same time, we don't want to actually put them in a scenario where they're doomed to fail in an overwhelmingly negative way. And then it leaves a really salty taste in their mouth in terms of dealing with a similar stressor in the future. You want to think about incremental pressure. Okay. Another thing which we've talked about is just initiating informal conversations about coping, right? So again, not everything has to be about performance and what exactly happened in a game or in a practice. It can just be a conversation around, how are you doing? What's going on in your life? Are you stressed out with school? Are you stressed out with your friends? And that really just illustrates to athletes, right, that yes, you're of course focused and worried about their performance because it's a sport that they enjoy. And at the same time, you also recognize that everything else that's going on in their lives does contribute to their ability to cope within the sporting context, right? So driving home, I love it when parents are able to drive kiddos to and from practices, games, etc. Because in those instances, I really feel like those car rides are just gems of experiences because it's just you and your athlete, and you can talk to them post-game, post-competition about anything it is that's going on in their lives and have that private conversation. Parents can also really create opportunities for athletes to learn about coping, right? So just structuring learning opportunities. Again, this is about kind of creating that incremental pressure. So parents, again, since you have a lot of control in some instances around what sort of stressful experiences kiddos encounter, you can dose appropriately. You can make sure that there is some incremental change in the amount of stress that they're exposed to. And then the last thing, which I think is the most obvious piece, is just direct instruction, right? So what that means is really almost like as if you're in a classroom, right? So talking about what exactly does something like deep breathing look like? What exactly does something like visualization look like? And again, if this is not your area of expertise, we don't expect that to be, right? This is where you can also pull in the supports of other support staff and other support networks. And that includes things like psychologists who are able to really provide that direct instruction in terms of what do coping strategies actually practically look like. Okay. So I want for a moment just to pay particularly attention to that initiating informal conversations piece. And I alluded to this earlier around like the car ride home. Okay, so perfect. All right. So as I mentioned, right, the drive home can be a really wonderful opportunity for parents to just check in with kids after practices, after games, after tournaments, etc. Right? So in general, what ends up happening is athletes sometimes endorse that they are enduring the car ride home, and sometimes they endorse that they enjoy the car ride home. So what exactly goes into that? Well, so, for those that really enjoy the car ride home, what that means is that the car ride home really provided this opportunity for athletes and parents to strengthen their relationship with their child, right? So what that meant was having those conversations in a non-threatening, non-judgmental way around coping and in a safe context. So what exactly does that look like? Well, so let's start by talking about what I think is the most controversial piece, which is to give or to not give feedback, right? So we're going to talk about this momentarily a little bit more, but oftentimes athletes actually do appreciate some sort of performance feedback from their parents. There is a caveat, however, to all of this, right? So when you notice that athletes don't appreciate parent feedback, what's going on there? Well, typically what we know is that those comments are coming immediately after a game. It actually doesn't matter whether or not the feedback is supportive or more critical. When you have those comments that immediately precede a game, immediately precede a practice, that can be really hard for athletes to take in, because essentially what is communicating to them is that there is this dominant performance narrative, right? So what that means is that performance is valued above all else, right? And that can be really detrimental to athletes just trying to better understand how to cope with various stressors. We want to make sure that what you're communicating is that performance is not the end all be all, and sports actually provides a really great context to, yes, have some fun and also get some real life experience dealing with stressors, right? So we'll again talk about this performance narrative a little bit more later, and specifically how it relates to giving feedback, but just wanted to give you a little teaser in terms of the feedback portion. What does lead to more of that enjoyment in the car ride is, again, having a little bit of a break in between a game or a practice and then having a discussion when you're in the car ride home, right? So more specifically, what that means is that you're in a car, there is a little bit of a privacy shield that comes up, right? So what that means is that you do have an opportunity to provide any sort of constructive criticism in private, in the car, away from athletes, away from coaches, right? And meanwhile, while they are with their coaches, while they are with their peers, outside, after practices, after games, provide some praise, something that you found to be helpful or positive about their game, right? But on the car ride home, have a little bit of a break, use the privacy shield of that contained environment, and then provide some constructive criticism after they've had a little bit of time to wind down from all the adrenaline of the game or the practice, right? The other really lovely thing about the car ride home is that because it is private, athletes can also share their anxieties and their concerns that maybe they don't feel comfortable talking about with teammates and coaches. So again, you want to be able to create an environment where teams want to come back to you and be able to talk to you about these stressors, right? So what does happen? Let's say you're in the car ride home, and what does happen if the conversation gets really upsetting? How do you tell, right? Well, take note of a lot of sarcasm. So lots of sarcasm and lots of avoidant behavior, right? So athletes can do things like they'll just give you the silent treatment, they'll stop responding to questions, they'll pretend they're listening to music, start texting friends. So shocker, right? If something is uncomfortable, they're going to act like other teenagers and other children and engage in the same avoidant behaviors that we've all seen before. Okay. So given now what we know about the car ride home, right? What does it mean in terms of other things that parents can do to facilitate coping? Again, so for starters, I know I've emphasized this before, but give them time to think and take time for yourself to think, right? So if we give them some time to think, really what that does is it allows athletes to potentially, right, recognize how it is that they're feeling and what it is that they're thinking and process what they'd like to do and maybe even what they'd like to do differently in the future, right? And for you as parents, it's actually incredibly important for you to also take some time to think, right? You're human, just like the athlete themselves. You're invested in their performance. You're invested in how they're coping. And so you're also high on adrenaline after games and after practices and after competitions. And so what that means sometimes is that if you act on that adrenaline, you say things you don't mean. Again, we're all human. So give yourself some time to think and model that time to think for your athletes as well, to just sort of process what happened, right? Another thing is de-emphasize those performance outcomes, right? So really, really try to make a conscious effort to always point out the effort level in a game, in a practice, in a competition, right? So even if you think as a parent, someone really had some poor performance, had a bad game, and the athlete themselves know that, right? Because they oftentimes have some insight into how they perform, right? Try to make a comment about the fact that they've worked really hard at getting better at another skill, and that showed. That effort, that passion for the game really showed. Ask questions in a supportive manner, right? So try to say, so what did you learn from this experience, right? Do you feel like things are getting better? Even though I feel like, you know that you wanted to perform a little bit better, what do you think is getting better, right? Another thing is develop rules of the road, right? So you might consider asking your athlete, right? Like, do you mind having a conversation right now? Do you need a little bit more time and space to think? Okay, that's fine, right? Like take a few more minutes and then we'll chat a little bit later, right? You might just actually also determine that maybe you need to start with something positive. So that way it's easier for your athlete to take in some of that constructive feedback, right? And lastly, again, seems a little bit like a no-brainer, but be positive, be supportive, no matter what it is that you're discussing. At the end of the day, again, the goal is to be positive and be supportive so that your kids, your athletes feel comfortable coming back to you again the next time they struggle. Okay, so we're going to circle back now to this idea of de-emphasizing performance outcomes, again, specifically as it relates to giving feedback. Now, there are going to be a lot of arrows that show up on your screens, so bear with me a little bit here. So what we know is that when children perceive parents, that their parents focus on effort and personal improvement, what that actually means is that athletes report higher levels and higher quality of motivation, perceives competence, enjoyment, effort, self-esteem, and sportsmanship. Right? And then similarly, again, when parents employ praise and encouragement along with that constructive feedback after competitions, that can lead to, again, increased motivation, increased confidence, increased positive affect or mood, just so actually physically the facial expressions that you're seeing on your kiddos' faces, right? And lastly, again, when parents employ positive reinforcement, right, that can actually increase perceptions of, again, competence and effort and help athletes rationalize their thoughts and their feelings. So just actually better understand what it is that they're going through. So in actuality, even if you're really focused on performance outcomes and motivation to train, as you can see, motivation, competence, and effort are all actually increase. The quality of those constructs are all actually increased by getting at it in this manner of providing praise, providing constructive feedback, providing a positively reinforcing environment, and focusing on effort and focusing on personal improvement. Okay. So now, what about how feedback is received by athletes? So turns out that actually the way that feedback is received is, unsurprisingly, influenced by how kiddos perceive their parents' knowledge base around the sports, right? So in general, kids report that when parents have appropriate knowledge about their sport, and that's through either playing or coaching or possess some sort of like adjacent, pertinent life or sport experience, right? Then providing sort of that tactical feedback, that technical feedback is far better received. And it actually enhances the enjoyment, concentration, and confidence of the athlete. Now, on the flip side, if there's any sort of unsolicited sport-specific feedback before or after competitions from parents who are really deemed to be lacking in the necessary knowledge or experience, then typically what that means is you're talking about kiddos who end up being confused, frustrated, pressured, and that tactical feedback that you're actually given isn't actually well received. Right? So a few more points just before we wrap up. So obviously, parents don't operate in a vacuum when it comes to the sporting context. They are interacting with other parents and with other kiddos, right? So for instance, what I want to talk about is just how do parents interacting with other parents affect kiddos and affect athletes. So when parents engage with other parents in a respectful and a supportive manner, right, children actually report that it enhances their enjoyment of the sport, right? And similarly, when children have noticed that parents actually encourage and congratulate other kids, and that actually means both kids on their team and on opposing teams, right, that can enhance their enjoyment, increase motivation, and reduce feelings of embarrassment, right? And again, on the flip side, let's look at parents who engage in angry exchanges, right? When it comes to other parents or to other children, that actually leads to children feeling quite embarrassed and quite anxious. So again, the interactions that you're having with other parents and other children, regardless of which team they are on, you really want to carry forward that positivity, that encouragement, and that constructive feedback, because it's really leading to actually increased motivation, increased enjoyment, reduced embarrassment. And again, that's the most effective way at getting at things like training and performance outcomes. Okay. Now, the way in which parents interact with coaches, of course, unsurprisingly, also have an effect on kids' sports experience. So if parents end up questioning coaches or interfering with practices, that can result in feelings of pressure or anxiety for kiddos. And so in contrast, if there are some sort of open and honest relationships, open and honest communication between parents and coaches, that can actually increase a child's trust in their own coach, right? It can help parents to learn a little bit more about how they can be the most optimally involved in their sport as opposed to posing an interference to their sport, right? And it also helps both kiddos and parents learn how to best resolve athlete-coach conflicts. You are bound to have these conflicts over the course of your child's career. And so starting early and modeling appropriate conflict resolution with coaches can go a long way for kiddos, both when it comes to interacting with their own coaches and when it comes to interacting with their peers. Right? Okay, and so just to summarize some key points, since I know we're running out of time here, there is a real overlap between how adolescents and how children deal with stressors and coping in sports and in other areas of their life. So again, the sport context does not occur in a vacuum. It's unrealistic to presume that athletes and how they deal with their sport-related stressors are totally different than how they're going to deal with the rest of their lives, right? So if you're looking for them to be independent in how they cope and be persistent in how they cope, right, then those outcomes, that independence, that persistence, that actually needs to be modeled by parents. Those outcomes need to be modeled by parents as being important in other domains of their life outside of just the sporting context, right? So again, this comes back to dosing and limiting experiences that are stressful, right, in a way that fosters that independence and also fosters that persistence. And then lastly, I think the really important task for parents lies in kind of, again, this balance, negotiating the extent to which athletes are exposed to potential stressors, but also doing it in a way where they feel like they can deal with that stress in a supportive environment, right? So the key here really appears to be that, you know, it's not actually a bad thing for athletes to deal with stress. And in fact, it's a really positive thing, both for their sporting performance and for other domains of their lives. But the key is really making sure that they deal with that stress within the umbrella of this psychologically safe environment or this supportive environment, the supportive context. Okay. That's all we have. We have lots of references for people who are interested. But with the time we have left, we'd love to take some questions.
And I can't see people raising their hands. So Kristene, it's not showing up on my screen.
Oh, okay. Can you see the chat? Because I think they're
oh, is it on there? Okay, let's see. All right, let's see. It looks like Rachel is asking, I have a high schooler who is a competitive rower. She loves it, but it takes up so much time and energy, and she is likely not good enough to be recruited. I want to support her, but balancing academics, extracurriculars she loves, and sports seems to be excessive. How can I support her to enjoy the athletics in a more recreational manner when all those around her engage with it as it's the most important part of their lives?
Yeah. It's a great question and a very common experience for many athletes. Honestly, I think the first thing that I would recommend is just talk to your athlete, right? So make the observation that she is stuck in a really competitive context, a really competitive environment, and have an open conversation with her about how it is that she's enjoying that competitive environment. And if she's not enjoying that competitive environment, have her be an active participant in what that transition will look like to a more recreational context. If that's actually something she wants to do, it's very possible that even though she's in a competitive context, she's still enjoying it. And she actually is employing some coping strategies to get through that stress. So talk to her about those coping strategies as well, if she'd like to stay in that competitive context, and present yourself as a person who can help remind her to use those coping strategies and can bring her back down to earth if she does get sucked up in the whirlwind that is competitive sports, along with balancing all of the other stressors of life.
And I think as a parent too, especially being on the sidelines in this very competitive area of the country in general across so many different domains, it's easy to get into this narrative that the only thing that matters is being recruited into college or being recruited. But we know, I mean, that like recreational activity has like beyond throughout life has so many amazing positive consequences, right? So like encouraging somehow your athlete to sort of think beyond that, right? Like if she's a competitive rower, she's got like so many skills, right, that can translate into things that she can do into her 20s, 30s, into her 80s even, right? And trying to think about that. I know how hard that is when you're on the sidelines in the Bay Area. So.
Sylvia asked, how can a parent encourage communication from the child when the child shuts down?
Great question. And you are bound to deal with it as a parent because, again, you're human and you make mistakes. So, again, I think what it comes down to is observing the fact that your kiddo has shut down first and foremost, right? So making a guess and saying, hey, you know, I'm noticing that maybe this conversation is a little tough. What is it that I can do right now to reset? And if they don't have any response to that question, being like, you know, why don't we take a few minutes, regroup, let's just take a break, let's take a 5-10 minute break, and let's see where you're at in 10 minutes. And then let's see if we can restart the conversation, or if there's something that you need before we restart the conversation. Maybe that's taking a shower, maybe that's having some food, whatever it is, right? But basically making the observation that your child has shut down and actually asking them what it is that they need before they can re-engage in the conversation. And if they don't have any responses, then you suggesting some things. And again, just constantly revisiting whenever it is that they feel like they can engage in that conversation again.
This is from Olivia. My 15-year-old gets so upset when he loses matches. He takes it so hard and so personally. It stays with him sometimes for multiple days. He dismisses my praise for effort. Any suggestions to help him move through losses more quickly?
Yeah, this is the classic athlete complex, I think, right? Because athletes are so invested in their performance that really anything less than perfection just takes a toll on them, right? So this takes a lot of practice, a lot of energy, and a lot of effort, both on the side of the athlete and on the side of the parent. So as early as possible, what I would recommend is actually having the athlete lead the conversation in terms of what they have done well, regardless of their performance, at the end of every practice and at the end of every game. So actually prompting them to identify 1 to 3 things that they feel like they have done well, right? And there's no but attached to the end of the statement, right? Not, I did well with my shooting, but I could have done better with my passing. No, just actually identifying a few things that they've done well. It doesn't mean that they don't get to talk about the things that they feel like they didn't do well, but when they do want to talk about that, what that means is then you're also prompting them saying, okay, I hear you that you want to focus on improving your passing. What are some of the things that you already do well to help you get there, right? So it's having them identify their strengths independently, along with understanding how they can use their toolbox already to scaffold better performance.
So we can take these last 2 questions. Are there sports psychology resources in the area that we can look for?
Great question. And honestly, so there are sports psychology resources, but athlete mental health and coping is actually, I would say, a real gap in the mental health world. So sports psychology will really help people improve their performance, right? So how are you going to better perform under pressure, things like that, but it won't necessarily actually focus on the coping piece.
And then last question, for injured athletes, do you have any recommendations for coping strategies, i.e. like can't play or they're on the bench, etc.?
Yeah, I'll really briefly mention this. I think the best place to start is when you've been injured in the past, what have you done, right? So using past prior successes to help them build their arsenal of things that they can rely on to deal with being on the bench. Otherwise, I think it's also finding ways that they can contribute to, if they are in a team sport, they can contribute to the team sport despite the fact that they're injured. So if it's helpful for them showing up to practices and showing up to games and almost acting like a personal coach, right? They can notice things that maybe other people can't notice in the moment, right? And potentially they're also picking up on ways that they would like to improve their performance when they do get back into the game. Yeah.
I think that was it for the question.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Right.
Yeah, we're so grateful and we're hoping to do more more in this area moving forward. So like Kristene mentioned, there's a gap in the young space. So stay tuned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks, everyone.